Welcome to Ancient Greece, Social Studies, World History, Standard 3. The geography of Greece and the development of naval powers. One thing we need to understand about the geography of Greece is that it is sealed off to the north by mountains, protected to the south, west, and east by water, and much of the landscape is a series of peninsulas and islands. The origins and structure of the Greek polis. The Greek polis was a city-state. That's right, the polis is the focal point of the basic political unit. We still see this word around today. Words like police, politics, Indianapolis, Annapolis, Minneapolis, Metropolis. It's still around a lot. City-states were easy to control, but there's a lot of city-states, and they ultimately came in conflict with each other. At the center of each city-state was an agora, a central meeting place for the Greek city-states. And they varied in form of government. Here are some forms of government, the first of which is a monarchy. Hopefully you're familiar with this concept. It's a state which is ruled by a king, and we saw this form of government in a place called Mycenae, one of the first Greek civilizations. Another form of government is an aristocracy. It's a state ruled by nobility. This one is also typically hereditary, and your role in the government is usually based upon your status and wealth. We saw this one practiced in Athens. Still yet another form of government was an oligarchy. This is a small group of citizens ruling a city-state, and we saw this form of government in Sparta. Another form was tyranny. Now today when we talk about being a tyrant, it's a bad thing. But originally a tyrant was a person who had all the power and ruled for the people. They had noble intentions and wanted to provide for the people. So you could even go up to your building principal and say, "Hey, principal, whatever your name is, you're a tyrant," in the classical sense of Greece. And you should be able to not get suspended. Or you might get suspended. Maybe don't try it. Another form of government is direct democracy, which is a state ruled by the citizens. All the citizens vote on every issue. And we saw this form practiced in Athens. Is the U.S. a direct democracy, you ask? Well, that's an owl. In fact, that's a spotted barn owl. Do you care about those? Well, no one gives a hoot, unless, of course, you're a congressman and that's your job. See, in the United States, we have a representative democracy, because while we care about some issues, we'd rather our congressmen did the decision-making for us. Sparta and Athens, two key city-states. Sparta had an oligarchy. They were very militaristic, and it was a small group of people running this society. You could retire at the age of 60, if you were alive. Now, Athens, on the other hand, was a democracy, and one of their best-known diplomats was a guy named Pericles, and he helped Athens to become an intellectual powerhouse. Now, don't think that they didn't know how to fight, because they did, but they were better known for their governmental structures. In case you don't know where they are, this is Sparta. And this is Athens. So they were very close to each other, which was good and bad. The Persian Wars were a series of conflicts between the Greeks and, you guessed it, the Persians. Eventually, they would unify and allow the Greek city-states to prosper. And by the end of these conflicts, it was a Greek victory. Certainly, the ginormous Persian Empire could have conquered all of Greece if they wanted to, but they decided to go in a different direction and establish one of the largest empires of all time, except for taking over Greece, which I guess they didn't want. Now, after the Persian Wars, there were accusations going back and forth between Athens and Sparta over who was responsible for some money being lost, other issues arising, and so eventually they started fighting each other. As you can see in the bottom right image, the boxing glove represents Sparta, and the brain represents Athens. Now, while they both could fight and they both could think, clearly Sparta was better at fighting than Athens, and they defeated Athens. Sparta was the dominant military city-state. Now, this young man here, his name is Herodotus, and you can thank him for your history books. That's right, he's the father of modern history. He was one of the first people to attempt to document firsthand events that were going on and compile them into a historical narrative. Herodotus was attempting to find a way to discriminate between fact and fiction. He wanted to record that which was true. Of course, it was only the stuff he thought was cool. Ancient Greek philosophers. Doesn't that look like a party you would want to go to? Well, maybe not. Here we have our first philosopher, Socrates. He was the first great Greek philosopher that we would talk about. He wanted people to think about their values and actions. He wanted to push his students to continually ask, why? And in their answers, they should answer, why? Now, for this Socratic method of questioning, his students became stronger, but also he kind of disrupted society a little bit, because then all of his students started asking their parents, why? And that, amongst other things, eventually led him to being sentenced to death. Not cool. But he was. Next up is Plato, not to be confused with Plato. Plato, on the other hand, was a Greek student of Socrates, and he wrote a book called The Republic, which was about a perfectly governed society, where only the elite would handle decision-making, which sounds an awful lot like a representative democracy. He started something called the Academy, which was a school for philosophy. And who wants a society governed in that fashion, where someone else is making decisions for you? Well, I do. Me too. 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 Woo, this chair is nice. Aristotle, our next great philosopher, was a student of Plato. That's right, a student of Plato at the Academy. And he developed a concept similar to the scientific method, and he classified governments into monarchies, democracies, and republics. And he also taught a young man named Alexander of Macedon, Alexander the So-So, Alexander the Shepherd, later known as Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, as you know, was a student of Aristotle. He was a prince of Macedon, and he eventually followed in his father's footsteps and began to conquer Egypt, Persia, India, unified Greece, and as he did this, he established something called Hellenistic culture, which was a blend of Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and Indian cultures. That's right, it was a blend of Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and Indian cultures. This was intended to unify all the lands which he had conquered. He wanted everyone to get along. Unfortunately for him, he died when he was 33, of a heart that no longer worked. Here is the true span of his empire. And of note during this time period was that Athens, which had been the intellectual center of the world, was no longer the intellectual center of the world. Now it was Alexandria, named after Alexander. You guessed it. Euclid, every high schooler's favorite guy, because he founded modern geometry. That's right, Euclid was the founder of modern geometry, and he was free to develop that, and he was also in Alexandria, which, as we know, is the intellectual center of the world. It's an example of Hellenistic cultural diffusion, because math had made its way, some of those concepts, from India to Persia to Egypt, and then, next thing you know, modern geometry. Are you kidding me? That's really funny, trust me.